Hello, my name is Maddie Hennicke. I'm an electronic resources librarian at the University of Virginia. Today, I'll be presenting VPATS 101, a quick guide to digital accessibility documentation from vendors. I'll start with a bit of background. The basis for me learning about this topic was the new Americans with Disabilities Act rule for Title II institutions that was published in April 2024. Title II is the part of the ADA that contains accessibility requirements for state and local governments. So, as a state university, this applies to the University of Virginia. The deadline to be compliant varies based on the size of the government, but for us, it's April 24th, 2026. Earlier this year, I was tasked with coordinating a project to gather accessibility documentation from our library's database vendors so we could demonstrate we were complying with the rule. As a new e-resources librarian, I had to quickly get up to speed on digital accessibility terminology and standards. Over time and through trial and error, I honed my approach to working with vendors as I gained more experience. This presentation is a way for me to share what I learned. The first thing I'd like to go over are key accessibility terms and standards. A very important term is Accessibility Conformance Report, or ACR. This is a structured document that goes point by point and lists how a vendor is complying with specified accessibility criteria. When you're collecting documentation, you'll primarily be collecting ACRs. The next term is Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, or VPAT. As it says in the name, this is a template. It can be used to format an ACR. VPAT is a registered term created by the Information Technology Industry Council. You can download blank VPATs for free from their website. The term VPAT is commonly used to refer to an accessibility conformance report, since VPATs are so frequently used to create them. As a result, you'll likely hear VPAT more often than ACR. That's why I chose to use it for the title of this presentation. Another very important term is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. These are a set of criteria created by the World Wide Web Consortium. These criteria are the standard that the ADA is using to evaluate whether a resource is accessible. Please note you will generally see numbers and letters after the WCAG acronym when it appears on a VPAT. The number refers to the version of the WCAG being used because the criteria get updated regularly. For example, 2.2 is the most recent version. A through AAA or AAA refers to the level of conformance, with A being the most basic level of accessibility and AAA being the highest level, and therefore the hardest to attain. The ADA is looking for WCAG 2.1 AA compliance, so that is the specific criteria you will want your vendors to meet or exceed. I want to just briefly mention Section 508. Section 508 refers to accessibility criteria that apply to federal agencies, so you may see these criteria go by as you're collecting documentation, whether that's VPATs based solely on Section 508 or VPATs that contain both WCAG and Section 508 criteria. Finally, I'd like to touch on accessibility statements and accessibility roadmaps. An accessibility statement is less structured than a VPAT. Usually, it's a paragraph in which a vendor states their dedication to accessibility and gives some plain language info about the accessibility of their resource. An accessibility statement's length and included information vary a lot between vendors. An accessibility roadmap is a detailed plan of how a vendor is working towards compliance with accessibility standards. These are more specific than accessibility statement. If a vendor does not have a VPAT, then a roadmap may be sufficient in the short term to avoid being seen as non-compliant. Here is what the VPAT looks like. You'll see it says that it is an accessibility conformance report based on VPAT version 2.5 revised. This one is the WCAG edition, so the included criteria are based on those guidelines. At the beginning here, the vendor can indicate at what level they are evaluating their product. And here is an example of a table in a VPAT. There are tables for level A, AA, and AAA. The vendor will indicate in the conformance level column whether their resource supports, partially supports, or does not support the criterion. They can also indicate that a certain criterion is not applicable or that it was not evaluated. Now I'd like to share some tips to optimize your approach to collecting documentation. First, always remember to work smarter, not harder. For many of your resources, you'll need to reach out to vendors one by one over email, but it's worth it to check if the documentation is already available on the database's website and save yourself some time. Also, don't duplicate effort. For example, if you're part of a consortium, investigate whether your consortium already has a digital accessibility working group that is collecting VPATs. However, also make sure that any documentation you source from others is the most recent documentation. Double check with your vendor if you're not sure. Finally, and very importantly, plan ahead for ongoing maintenance. Choose early on what documentation storage method will be used based on the needs of your organization. Ask questions like, who will need to access these files? How frequently will we need to pull this documentation? Can we store these files in the same place we store our licenses to keep all documentation for a vendor together? These questions can guide whether you use something simple like a shared folder or something more sophisticated like electronic resource management software. Another important maintenance task is to regularly check for updated documentation. The vendor won't necessarily notify you when they've come out with a new VPAT. The last subject I'll cover in this presentation is working with vendors. One thing I've learned over the past months is that different vendors can have very different knowledge bases regarding digital accessibility. Don't assume that they will know what you mean if you say VPAT or that they will understand the importance of providing documentation to their Title II clients. When I first started reaching out to vendors, my emails were very brief and simply requested a VPAT. Over time, I developed an email script that included more context for why I was asking and links to definitions of terms. This was helpful for vendors who knew less about digital accessibility, and it also demonstrated to them why this was important for our organization. I'll add that sometimes the act of asking can prompt vendors to perform evaluations if they haven't already, so it's always worth it to reach out. Next, keep in mind that you may be able to ask the vendor to provide you with an up-to-date VPAT as part of license negotiation. In this way, you can use the leverage of negotiations to get the documentation you need. Finally, if the vendor truly isn't willing or able to provide documentation, third parties can perform evaluations of web resources. In those cases, once again, check if someone has already done the work. For example, the Library Accessibility Alliance has a page of over 100 e-resource reports that they've created for various resources. Okay, that concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching. Here is my contact information. Please reach out if you have any questions or if you have suggestions based on your experience. I'm still learning and would be happy to hear from others who are doing the same work.